In the winter of 1940, a single Finnish farmer stopped an army, not with a new weapon, not with superior numbers, not with technology. He did it by exploiting something most modern armies never admit they have: a blind spot. In 98 days, he killed 542 Soviet soldiers, more than any sniper in history. Entire patrols vanished without firing back. Counter-sniper teams failed. Artillery failed. Hunting parties failed. The Soviet army never solved him. And this story is not about how accurate he was. Most people already know the numbers. What they don't understand is why those numbers were possible at all. Why trained soldiers froze instead of adapting. Why modern doctrine collapsed against something so simple. Why one man with iron sights and patience forced an army to change how it fought. If you listen carefully to how this happened, step by step, you'll see something uncomfortable. The outcome of the Winter War was not decided by firepower. It was decided by a mistake no one was prepared to recognize. And once that mistake was exposed, it was already too late. The mistake began long before the first shot was fired. It began with how the Soviet army understood danger. In 1940, the Red Army was one of the largest military forces on Earth. Millions of men, thousands of tanks, artillery, aircraft, logistics, doctrine. Everything about it was designed to defeat visible threats, enemy formations, defensive lines, machine gun nests, artillery positions. This system worked against enemies who behaved the way doctrine expected. But Finland was not fighting that kind of war. The terrain didn't allow it. The weather didn't allow it. And one man understood this before anyone else did. Simo Häyhä did not think like a soldier trained for mass combat. He thought like a hunter who understood that the most dangerous prey is the one that never realizes it is being hunted. When the Winter War began on November 30th, 1939, Soviet planners expected speed to solve everything: overwhelming force, rapid movement, pressure along multiple axes. What they encountered instead was silence, dense forests, narrow trails, frozen ground, visibility measured in meters, not kilometers. The Red Army still advanced using doctrine designed for open terrain and large formations. Columns followed roads, patrols moved predictably. Units relied on mutual visibility and audible contact, and this predictability became fatal. Häyhä noticed it immediately. He was not impressed by Soviet numbers. He was not intimidated by their equipment. To him, they moved like animals, unaware they were already inside a trap. He did not seek combat. He did not seek engagement. He waited for exposure. This distinction matters. Most snipers are taught to defeat an enemy sniper. Häyhä was doing something different. He was attacking movement itself. Any soldier who stepped into open snow, paused too long, or followed the same route twice was no longer a combatant. He was a target. The Soviet army responded the way modern armies always do. They assumed the threat was technical. They sent counter-sniper teams equipped with scopes and spotters. They deployed artillery to suspected firing positions. They ordered patrols to search aggressively. Each response made sense on paper. Each response failed on the ground, because none of them addressed the actual problem. They were hunting a sniper. But Häyhä was not operating as a sniper in the conventional sense. He was operating as a disruption inside their perception loop. He did not fire from obvious vantage points. He did not stay long enough to be confirmed. He did not reveal patterns that doctrine could classify. Every time Soviet forces reacted, they reacted to the wrong signal. They searched where the shot came from. He had already moved. They watched for muzzle flash. His muzzle was buried in snow. They waited for breath vapor. He chilled his breath until it vanished. The Soviets believed they were fighting an enemy with superior equipment. That belief blinded them to the truth. They were fighting an enemy who refused to be seen in the way they expected. This is why entire patrols disappeared. Not because they were reckless, not because they were incompetent, but because their training taught them to look for danger in specific forms, and Häyhä existed outside those forms. Each kill reinforced the illusion. Officers assumed multiple shooters. Reports spoke of teams, networks, coordinated fire. No one could accept that a single man, operating alone, could cause this level of damage. That assumption delayed adaptation, and delay in war is lethal. By the time Soviet command recognized that something fundamental was wrong, fear had already spread. Soldiers began to hesitate. Patrols slowed. Volunteers declined. The forest itself became hostile. Men stepped carefully, watched shadows, listened for sounds that never came. The threat was no longer a rifle. The threat was uncertainty. He-Ha understood this instinctively. He did not chase numbers. He did not rush for kills. He allowed fear to do part of the work. Every soldier who refused to advance, every patrol that delayed, every unit that hesitated gave Finland time. And time was the only resource Finland could not afford to lose. This is the part most summaries ignore. The 542 kills were not just eliminations. They were interruptions. Interruptions of momentum. Interruptions of planning. Interruptions of morale. The Soviet army was not losing men at random. It was losing confidence in its own ability to control the battlefield. And that loss began with something no field manual prepared them for. An enemy who did not behave like an enemy was supposed to. By the end of the Winter War, analysts would point to weather, terrain, logistics. All of those mattered, but none of them explain why one man could force an army to question itself. That explanation lies in what happened next, because once the Soviets understood they were being hunted by something they could not categorize, they escalated. And that escalation would lead directly to the moment when the invisible hunter was finally seen. The first confirmed kills did not announce themselves as something extraordinary. They looked ordinary. One shot, one body, silence. On December 10th, 1939, a Soviet officer paused near the tree line, organizing a patrol. He stood just long enough to be noticed. He-Ha was already in position. He did not rush the shot. He waited for stillness, not in the target, but in himself. The rifle rose, iron sights aligned. The trigger broke cleanly. The officer collapsed. What happened next was predictable, and that predictability was the point. Another soldier moved toward the body. He wanted to help, or confirm, or understand. A second shot followed. Then, nothing. No return fire, no shouting, no pursuit. He-Ha did not move. This was not hesitation. It was discipline. He waited because experience had taught him that panic creates opportunity. The patrol withdrew. 2 men down. No contact established. No enemy located. He-Ha recorded the time, distance, and conditions in a small log, not as a trophy count, as data. Over the following days, this pattern repeated with disturbing consistency. Soviet patrols followed the same trails. They paused at the same clearings. They grouped together in the same way. They behaved like soldiers moving through hostile terrain, not like prey being watched. He-Ha refined his routine. He left Finnish lines before first light, moved forward alone, never directly, selected positions that did not look tactical, snowdrifts, fallen trees, uneven ground. He cleared snow around the muzzle so the blast would not throw a visible cloud. He packed snow tightly beneath himself to absorb movement. Only his rifle and part of his face were exposed. Everything else was erased into the landscape. He preferred engagement distances that allowed certainty, far enough to avoid detection, close enough that wind and drop were predictable. He fired once. Then he waited. If nothing happened, he waited longer. If movement appeared, he fired again, but never more than 3 shots from one position. 3 shots was the limit. More than that allowed the enemy time to react. After the 3rd shot, he moved sometimes only 50 meters, sometimes more. Often, Soviet return fire struck the position he had just abandoned. Machine guns, rifle volleys, occasionally artillery. They were always late. By December 22nd, his confirmed total had reached levels that began to trouble his own commanders, not because they doubted him, Because no one had seen anything like it before, verification required caution. Witnesses were rare, he operated alone. But when Finnish units reclaimed ground, the evidence matched his reports. Bodies fell where he said they would. Distances aligned. Conditions made sense. The kills were real. The Soviets began to notice. Not strategically, psychologically. Patrols returned missing men. Sometimes entire sections failed to come back. Survivors could not explain what had happened. They heard a single shot. A man fell. Then another. They fired blindly into trees. Nothing answered. The enemy had no shape. And when a threat has no shape, fear fills in the gaps. The name appeared in reports first, then in whispers. White Death. Tenchi. It was not a title meant to honor. It was a warning. Soviet officers assumed they were facing a sniper team. That assumption mattered because it shaped every decision that followed. They believed the solution was technical, so they deployed counter-sniper units. Men trained specifically to hunt shooters, pairs with scoped rifles. Observers trained to catch muzzle flash and breath vapor. The doctrine was sound. It failed completely. He-Ha did not fire from elevated positions. He did not create flashes that scopes could catch. His breath did not rise into the cold air. He fired low, from snow-packed positions that swallowed light and sound. The counter-snipers watched places where snipers were supposed to be. He-Ha was never there. They listened for shots and triangulated sound, but snow distorted acoustics, and he moved before the calculation could be completed. The hunters began to feel hunted. Every failed attempt reinforced the myth. Officers escalated. Artillery was brought forward. Suspected areas were shelled, forests ripped apart, snow thrown into the air. When Finnish scouts checked the impact zones later, they found destruction, but no body. He-Ha had observed the preparations and moved long before the shells arrived. The Soviets believed they were closing in. In reality, they were chasing echoes. This is where the method fully revealed itself. He-Ha was not reacting to Soviet actions. He was letting Soviet actions reveal their thinking. Each countermeasure told him what they expected. Each expectation told him where not to be, and every failure deepened their confusion. By the end of December, his average kill rate was no longer an anomaly. It was a constant. Day after day, men disappeared. Not during assaults, not during major engagements. During routine movement, the safest moments of a soldier's day. And that is what broke morale, not the numbers. The uncertainty. Soviet soldiers slowed their pace. Some refused patrols. Officers were forced to issue threats. The forest no longer felt neutral. It felt hostile. He-Ha understood that fear was now a force multiplier. He did not rush to exploit it. He let it mature, because the more the enemy hesitated, the more predictable their behavior became. And predictability, as he had learned long before the war, always ends the same way, with a still target and a single shot. By January 1940, the situation along the Kola front had changed, not on the maps, not in official communiqué, but in the minds of the men walking the forest trails. Soviet soldiers no longer moved as units confident in superiority. They moved cautiously. They stopped often. They looked at the snow instead of the horizon. They were no longer advancing into enemy territory. They were entering a place where something unseen was already waiting. Command understood that morale was slipping. And when morale slips, armies do not adapt quietly. They escalate. More counter-sniper teams were sent into the Kala sector. Not one or two pairs, but multiple teams, rotating, overlapping, saturating the area. These men were professionals. They knew the doctrine. They had equipment designed for this exact problem. Scopes with magnification. Spotters trained to detect movement. Patience drilled through repetition. On paper, this should have ended it. But He-Ha was not presenting a problem that doctrine could close, because doctrine assumed one thing above all else, that the sniper wanted to fight. He-Ha did not. He wanted to finish. The counter-snipers waited for muzzle flash. He fired from below snow level. They watched likely vantage points. He chose positions that looked useless. They listened for sound. The forest absorbed it. They waited for breath vapor. His breath never showed. Each failed encounter increased their certainty that they were dealing with a network. One man could not do this. That belief was the most dangerous error of all, because it meant they kept searching for coordination where none existed. And every day, they searched for something complex. Something simple continued to kill them. Hey-ha adjusted as pressure increased. He shortened his exposure times, moved more frequently, changed approach routes, but the core of his method remained unchanged. He still selected targets based on behavior, not rank. Anyone who paused too long, anyone who separated from cover, anyone who behaved as if the forest was passive, and the numbers kept climbing, not dramatically, relentlessly. By the end of January, confirmed kills had crossed thresholds that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Entire units refused to enter certain areas. Officers rotated men aggressively to prevent superstition. It did not help. Fear does not respond to orders. It responds to evidence. And the evidence lay frozen in the snow. Command escalated again. If snipers could not find him, then firepower would erase him. Artillery was brought forward in greater numbers. Instead of targeted strikes, the order changed to saturation. Suspected areas were shelled indiscriminately. Trees were shredded. Snow churned into mud and fragments. Visibility increased. From the Soviet perspective, this made sense. Remove cover, force exposure, eliminate concealment. It worked against static positions. He-ha was not static. He observed artillery preparation. He listened to the changes in sound, watched movement patterns shift, recognized the signs before the first shell landed, and he moved. Sometimes hundreds of meters, sometimes before dawn, sometimes while the bombardment was still being planned. When Finnish scouts later checked the impact zones, they found devastation, and nothing else. No body, no blood, no confirmation. The artillery had destroyed empty ground. This failure marked a turning point. Because the Soviets were no longer reacting to shots, they were reacting to absence. They were spending shells to destroy places where they believed he might be, and that belief was shaped by fear, not evidence. Meanwhile, He-ha exploited the very thing meant to stop him. The bombardment stripped cover, but they also simplified the environment. Fewer hiding places meant fewer movement options, and fewer movement options meant more predictability. He adjusted his firing windows. Instead of engaging closer, he pushed farther out. Longer distances meant lower hit probability for return fire. They also required precision, but precision was not new to him. Years of hunting had already built the instinct. At longer ranges, he fired less often, but each shot mattered more, and the impact on morale increased. By early February, the situation reached a point few officers wanted to acknowledge. The presence of a single unseen shooter was shaping operational decisions. Patrols were delayed. Routes were changed. Timetables slipped. A single man was dictating tempo. This is the moment the hunt inverted. The Soviet army believed it was hunting White Death, but White Death was shaping how they moved, how they waited, how they feared. He-ha was no longer simply removing soldiers. He was forcing the enemy to second-guess every decision. And second-guessing is fatal in combat. February arrived with colder temperatures. Visibility increased as darker uniforms contrasted sharply against white snow. The environment itself now favored the hunter. He-ha extended his effective range again, not recklessly, selectively. He waited for conditions that favored certainty, clear lines, minimal wind, targets that moved exactly where experience told him they would. This was his deadliest period, not because he became more aggressive, but because the enemy had become more constrained. They moved less freely. They hesitated more. They bunched together when they should have spread out. And that hesitation created opportunities. By mid-February, his confirmed count had reached levels that even Soviet command could no longer ignore. The conclusion was unavoidable. Whatever they were doing, it was not enough. So, they prepared their final escalation. Not to find the shooter, but to destroy the environment itself. And in doing so, they set the stage for the moment when the invisible hunter would finally be seen. By mid-February 1940, the Soviets stopped pretending they could solve the problem. They no longer spoke about finding the shooter. They spoke about erasing the ground he used. Artillery schedules changed. Not reactive strikes, routine destruction. Hundreds of shells per day fell across the Kola sector. Forests were reduced to splinters. Snow mixed with soil and shrapnel. The objective was simple. Remove cover, remove concealment, remove the possibility of invisibility. It was the most extreme response they had left. For most snipers, this would have been the end. For He-Ha, it was another variable to adapt to. He reduced exposure time, 90 minutes at most. He shifted positions daily, sometimes multiple times a day. He stopped using positions that looked perfect. With Aldo, perfect positions attract attention. Instead, he chose places that looked useless, low ground, broken snow, irregular shapes that didn't resemble fighting positions. The forest was disappearing, but predictability remained, and predictability was still lethal. February 17th arrived with clear air and brutal cold. Visibility stretched farther than usual. Dark figures stood out against the white ground. He-Ha moved before dawn, alone as always, selecting a position near a known movement route. He settled into the snow, not hurried, not tense. He had done this hundreds of times. At 6:30 a.m., a Soviet patrol appeared. 12 men. They moved carefully, not casually, weapons ready, spacing tighter than doctrine advised. They were afraid. Fear changes behavior, but it doesn't eliminate mistakes. The patrol followed a route that had been used before. They paused where others had paused. He-Ha waited. The first shot dropped the lead soldier. No warning. No visible origin. The patrol froze. That hesitation was fatal. The second and third shots followed, quickly measured, controlled. Men fell into the snow without understanding why. Some returned fire. They fired at shadows, at trees, at memories of where shots should have come from. It didn't help. Within 4 minutes, the patrol was destroyed. 11 dead. One wounded survivor who fled without answers. He-Ha did not celebrate. He relocated immediately. The day was not over. He found another patrol later that morning, then another. He moved methodically, never staying long enough to be fixed. By the end of the day, 16 Soviet soldiers were dead. 19 rounds fired, 16 hits, 3 misses. The numbers mattered not for pride, but because they confirmed something important. Despite artillery, despite counter-snipers, despite fear, the method still worked. But the margin was shrinking. The Soviets noticed the pattern, not the shooter but the timing. They began deploying specialized hunter patrols, small teams, disciplined movement, eyes trained on snow disturbances, not silhouettes. This was different. He-Ha encountered one such patrol in early March. 6 men. They did not move like ordinary patrols. They scanned the ground. They advanced cautiously. They were not looking for an enemy in front of them. They were looking for a problem embedded in the terrain. He-Ha observed them from distance. He calculated the shot. Longer range than usual. Wind crossing left to right. Bullet. Drop. Significant. He fired. The lead soldier fell. This time, the response was immediate and accurate. Return fire pinned his position. Not panic. Discipline. Rounds struck close. Too close. He-Ha could not relocate. The fire was controlled, sustained, and deliberate. Then one round found him. It struck his face. The impact destroyed his jaw, shattered teeth, tore tissue apart. The shock was massive. Blood filled his mouth. He could not speak, could not breathe properly. For a moment, survival replaced method. He abandoned the rifle. He began crawling back toward Finnish lines nearly 300 meters away. Every movement left a trail. Blood stained the snow. The Soviet patrol followed, attempting to confirm the kill. They believed they had finally solved the problem. At 6:37 Finnish machine guns opened fire. Sustained bursts cut off the pursuit. Soldiers ran forward, reached Heihe, dragged him back under cover. He was alive barely. Medics worked quickly. His airway was compromised. They cut a breathing path in the field. Crude. Last. Immediate. Necessary. He was evacuated to a field hospital. Surgeons worked for hours. They rebuilt what they could. They saved his life by millimeters. The bullet had missed critical arteries by less than a finger's width. That distance was the difference between legend and anonymity. Heihe has survived, but his war was over. Days later, the Winter War ended. Finland lost territory but remained independent, and the numbers became final. Hundreds killed by rifle, dozens more in close combat. 542 confirmed kills in 98 days. The deadliest sniper campaign in recorded history. But the most important consequence wasn't the number. It was what the Soviets learned too late. You can destroy terrain. You can flood an area with firepower. But if you never understand how you are being killed, you will always react one step behind. And in that gap, a single man can stop an army. When the Winter War ended in March 1940, the fighting stopped abruptly. The silence was jarring. For 98 days, the forests around Kola had absorbed gunfire, artillery, movement, fear. Then, almost overnight, it was over. Finland signed the Moscow Peace Treaty. Territory was lost. Borders shifted. Families were displaced. But Finland survived. That fact mattered more than land. In the aftermath, numbers began to circulate. Casualty figures, ratios, comparisons. The number attached to Heihe stood apart. 542 confirmed kills. It was repeated endlessly, quoted without context, used as proof of superiority or horror, depending on who was speaking, but the number alone explains nothing, because wars are not changed by body counts. They are changed by effects. And the effect of Heihe's actions was not simply the removal of soldiers, it was the distortion of Soviet decision-making. Throughout the Winter War, Soviet planners struggled to maintain momentum in sectors where resistance was invisible. Patrols slowed. Timelines slipped. Orders were rewritten. Resources meant for offensive action were diverted into containment. Artillery was used defensively instead of offensively. Counter-sniper units were tied down, chasing a problem they could not resolve. Fear spread beyond the front line. Reports filtered back. Stories changed as they traveled. What began as a sniper became something larger, something harder to define. And that uncertainty carried weight. A soldier who does not understand how men are dying does not move confidently. A commander who cannot identify the source of losses begins to overreact. By the time Soviet command shifted to saturation bombardment, the damage was already done. Not tactically, psychologically. Men hesitated to advance. Units bunched together. Officers resorted to threats to enforce movement. All of these behaviors increased vulnerability. The irony is that Heihe did not need to kill every soldier he encountered. He only needed to kill enough to make the rest doubt. This is why focusing on the kill count misses the point. The true impact lies in what those kills represented. Each one removed a man from the field, but each one also removed certainty from the system. The Soviet army entered Finland believing mass, speed, and doctrine would decide the war. Instead, it encountered an enemy that operated outside those assumptions. Heihe did not break Soviet formations. He broke Soviet expectations. And expectations are what doctrine is built on. When those expectations collapse, even overwhelming force becomes cautious. After the war, analysts attempted to explain what had happened. They pointed to extreme cold, to terrain, to Soviet tactical rigidity. All of these factors mattered, but none of them were sufficient on their own. Cold did not kill 542 men. Forests did not fire rifles. Doctrine did not pull triggers. A human being did. And that human being succeeded because he understood something uncomfortable. Modern armies train soldiers to recognize specific threats, Anything that does not fit those patterns creates hesitation. Heiha lived in that hesitation. He did not seek dramatic engagements. He did not seek recognition. He sought repeatable conditions. When asked later about his success, he never spoke about hatred or ideology. He spoke about necessity, duty, practice. After recovering from his injuries, Heiha did not return to combat. His face was permanently damaged. His jaw never fully healed. He was promoted, decorated, thanked, and then he disappeared back into civilian life. He did not lecture. He did not write memoirs. He did not build a reputation. When journalists pressed him years later, he deflected attention. He insisted he was not special, that he did what was required, that others would have done the same. This refusal to mythologize himself is important because it reinforces the real lesson of the Winter War. Heiha was not an anomaly created by luck. He was a product of alignment. Alignment between environment, mindset, skill, and enemy error. Remove any one of those elements, and the outcome changes. But during those 98 days, everything aligned. The terrain favored concealment. The weather punished mistakes. The enemy relied on rigid patterns, and one man refused to operate within those patterns. That combination changed the character of the war in ways no strategic plan anticipated. Finland did not win the Winter War in the traditional sense, but it denied the Soviet Union a decisive victory. And in doing so, it altered perceptions across Europe. Small nations observed that overwhelming force could be resisted, that discipline and adaptation could offset numbers, that systems could be disrupted by individuals who understood their blind spots. Heiha's legacy is often reduced to a statistic, but statistics fade. What remains is the lesson his actions revealed. When a system cannot recognize how it is being attacked, it cannot defend itself no matter how powerful it appears. And that lesson did not end in 1940. It remains relevant wherever doctrine replaces observation, where technology replaces judgment, and where armies assume the enemy will behave the way they expect. Because as the Winter War proved, the most dangerous opponent is not the one you can see. It is the one your system refuses to acknowledge. Simo Heiha did not return to the forest as a sniper. When the Winter War ended, his body survived, but the conditions that made his work possible were gone. His jaw had been destroyed, his face permanently altered, his war finished by a single bullet that arrived after 98 days of failure. For the Soviet army, that bullet became a convenient explanation. They could point to luck, to probability, to the idea that persistence eventually solved the problem. But that explanation avoided the deeper truth, because the real problem had already ended the moment the war stopped. Heiha did not need to be killed for the lesson to take effect. The lesson had already spread. In the months and years after the Winter War, military observers studied what had happened in Finland, not just the casualty figures, but the behavior, why units hesitated, why momentum collapsed, why a numerically superior force failed to impose its will quickly. They noticed something uncomfortable. Heiha did not win because he was invisible. He won because the enemy did not know what to look for. Modern armies train soldiers to identify threats based on expectation, movement, noise, shape, pattern. Those expectations are necessary. Without them, soldiers freeze. But those same expectations also create blind spots. Heiha operated entirely inside those blind spots. He did not fight doctrine. He bypassed it. This is why his success could not be solved with equipment. Scopes did not help. More men did not help. Artillery did not help. Every solution assumed the problem existed within the system. It did not. The Soviet army eventually tried to destroy the environment itself, and even that worked only partially, because by the time it happened, the damage to morale and tempo was already irreversible. After the war, Heiha returned to civilian life. He farmed again. He hunted occasionally. He lived quietly. He did not seek attention. When asked about his kills, he rejected the framing. He did not speak in numbers. He spoke in obligation. I did what was necessary. In 24, that statement is not modesty. It is precision. Heiha did not see himself as an exception. He saw himself as someone whose skills matched the situation. And that is what makes his story unsettling, because it suggests something most institutions dislike acknowledging. Extraordinary outcomes do not always come from extraordinary people. Sometimes they come from ordinary people placed in systems that misunderstand them. Heiha's skills were not created by war. They were created by years of hunting, patience, repetition, and restraint. The war simply revealed where those skills mattered most. This reframes the story entirely. The Winter War was not changed by a super sniper, its coming dolls. It was changed by a mismatch between expectation and reality. The Soviet army expected resistance to look a certain way. When it didn't, they reacted slowly. And slow reaction is fatal when conditions are unforgiving. Heiha's legacy, therefore, is not tactical. It is structural. It shows how systems fail. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, one assumption at a time. One patrol delayed. One order rewritten. One decision questioned. Until the system no longer trusts itself. That is when collapse begins. This lesson did not remain in Finland. Later, conflicts would echo the same pattern. Small units achieving disproportionate effects. Individuals exploiting gaps doctrine failed to cover. Technology amplifying skill, but never replacing it. And every time, the same mistake repeated. Decision makers focused on tools. They ignored perception. They asked how the enemy killed. They did not ask why the enemy was never seen. Heiha never articulated this lesson himself. He did not need to. His actions said enough. He demonstrated that dominance is not about overwhelming force. It is about understanding where force becomes irrelevant, where speed matters more than strength, where patience outperforms aggression, and where simplicity defeats complexity. By the time Heiha died in 2004, the world had changed. The Soviet Union no longer existed. Technology had transformed warfare. But the lesson from the frozen forests of 1940 remained intact. Systems still rely on expectation. Doctrine still creates blind spots. And enemies still exploit what institutions refuse to acknowledge. The difference is that now, the battlefield is not always a forest. Sometimes it is urban, sometimes digital, sometimes economic, sometimes psychological. But the principle is unchanged. When you train exclusively for what you expect, you become vulnerable to what you don't. Heiha did not defeat the Soviet army because he was unseen. He defeated them because they refused to believe that something so simple could matter. That refusal cost them time. Time cost them momentum. Momentum cost them control. And control, once lost, is rarely recovered quickly. This is why his story matters beyond the Winter War. Not as a celebration of killing, but as a warning. Power does not fail when it is challenged directly. It fails when it is challenged in ways it does not recognize. In 1940, one Finnish farmer exposed that truth in the harshest environment imaginable. He did not need speeches. He did not need recognition. He needed only one thing, a system that did not understand him. And that misunderstanding changed the course of a war.